Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this seminar. It's a pleasure today to welcome and introduce Professor Andres Sevtsuk from MIT, whom we met several years ago also at MIT. Andres is an associate professor of urban science and urban planning at MIT. His work bridges urban design, active mobility, and spatial analysis technology, and he's the director of the City Form Lab at MIT. Andres and I, our research team, are working on a project related to pedestrians and pedestrian mobility in Beirut after the explosion of the port, and we're trying to come up with recommendations to improve pedestrian mobility in the areas that were impacted by the blast. Professor Andres is the author of the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox, which is a software tool that models pedestrian flows over streets and cities. So he's going to tell us about these tools today. And he has also recently published a book entitled Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks. So please help me in welcoming Professor Andres Sevtsuk.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? This should be connected, right? I'll just use this mic. Thank you so much. Echo. Can we turn one of these off? Okay. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. We're very happy to collaborate with Dr. Abu Zaid's group on Beirut and modeling walkability here, which seems to be a really pertinent and timely topic based on the little that we've seen from the city so far, but also from a lot of materials we've seen remotely, analyzing the data and mapping Beirut over the last year that we've done in this collaboration. So today I plan to speak a little bit about first why pedestrian mobility is increasingly important to cities, not just here, but all over the world. Two, how we use tools to model pedestrian activities in cities. And three, show a couple of applied examples of actually developing a model of pedestrian activity for a city and understanding how the built environment affects pedestrian route choices in particular. Just to move. Okay. So many cities around the world are increasingly prioritizing pedestrians and public transport as a tandem together over vehicular traffic. They're diverting or changing how they invest into infrastructure, how they spend the municipal budgets, and prioritizing the street life that centers around human beings on their feet rather than human beings inside cars. Why are they doing that? What is so important about moving from this car-centric paradigm of the 20th century city that we still have as a legacy all around us today, including here in Beirut, but in many parts of the world, towards a city that offers much more diverse mobility options, where short trips can predominantly be achieved on foot or by cycling, where densities are high enough to have enough destinations to walk to around places where people live or where people work. And longer journeys accomplished by various forms.
From this one, I can unmute it.
Should I just maybe switch off the mic altogether? And walkable. I want to evoke a couple of key reasons why city governments have brought up as key motivators for them to change course, to invest more in pedestrian infrastructure and walkability more broadly. First of all, is the environmental argument. Many cities around the world are trying to cut their CO2 emissions, and transportation sector tends to be one of the highest contributor. Typically in urban areas, it is the highest contributor to CO2 emissions altogether. I've plotted here on the chart CO2 emissions per capita from the transportation sector from cities throughout the US. And you see that there's a direct relationship between density and transportation emissions. In denser cities, to the left of the chart, far fewer people use personal automobiles and get around more by either public transit or walking, and therefore have far lower CO2 emissions per capita. Now, in central Beirut, the population density exceeds 20,000 people per square kilometer. So Beirut would be really on the far left of this chart, and has the potential, if it were tapping into the potential of walkability, to majorly lower transportation emissions by shifting trips away from automobile travel to more sustainable forms. In the US, the transportation sector as a whole in the country consumes about 1/3. It's the largest emitting sector for CO2 emissions. And if you break that 1/3, the 29% down, about close to 60% of that is light duty vehicles, which is basically personal cars and small vans, etc. So it is the most critical component. And if we actually look within cities, because cities don't have agricultural productions, have much less industry than more exurban and rural areas, then inside cities, this is a chart from the city I come from in Tallinn, the transportation sector can be even higher than 30%. It can be 40% or plus contributor to CO2 emissions. So it's the first low-hanging fruit to address as a city if you want to cut CO2 emissions. If we look at the emissions per kilometer by type of mode, then obviously with zero emissions, walking or cycling is infinitely more sustainable than anything else. But even public transport, if we're talking about, for instance, rail transport like light rail, where we come to something around 15 grams of CO2 per passenger per kilometer, a combination of walking and public transport that uses light rail or BRTs can be something on the light rail or BRT itself in the order of 7 times less emissions per mile per passenger or per kilometer per passenger than by driving. So it's a major reason for conversion and change in attitude, how city governments invest into mobility and transportation. Second, there's the argument of public health. Public health comes up a lot all over the world. From, on the one hand, the issue of obesity that comes with lack of exercise in car-dominated societies, but also with respiratory diseases and other related illnesses and deaths that are caused by traffic. This slide shows how, and there's a sizable literature now that connects mobility to public health, and the body mass index is oftentimes used as a metric of the average person's body weight in American cities. In denser cities, like for instance, San Francisco, BMI tends to be significantly lower than in cities where everybody relies on driving, like Topeka, Kansas, or many other car-related towns in America. But this is not the only or perhaps most important aspect of public health from a mobility perspective. In the US, we also have in the order of 40,000 deaths in traffic every year. And in addition to that, almost 200,000 deaths every year caused by inactivity-related diseases that are heart-related diseases, respiratory diseases, and all of that combined that are related to the fact that people don't move on their feet that much, causing another about 200,000 deaths per year. So together, 240,000 deaths per year is an enormous number that is an indicator that cities are increasingly worried about and want to move away from. From a social reason, cities also see, especially today, as increasingly important the fact that people meet people and make new social connections in cities. And that evidently happens more when we get around on foot and by public transport being in the same shared spaces with other people. This graph here comes from a famous study by Mark Granovetter, who's a sociologist and studied social networks in the 1970s and came up with this concept of weak ties. By strong ties, Granovetter refers to connections that we have in our workplaces or families or sometimes faith-based organizations like churches, people that we meet regularly on a weekly basis, maybe even on a daily basis. And Granovetter argued that, in fact, for societies to transmit information and gain access to opportunity, it is rather the weak ties that are important. And the weak ties are people we meet once a month or once in a few months, maybe once a year at a conference, etc. And we generally tend to have a bigger circle of those people than the close ties or strong ties with, around us. For instance, he demonstrated that people are much more likely to find a job through a weak link than a strong link. Now, this pegs the question, where do the ties even originate from? Where do we establish our social ties? And in urban environments, strong ties represent people we work with or study with or live with. Weak ties may be people we meet at a conference or at a social engagement once a few months. But I'd argue that we also foster and establish latent ties, ties that are seeded by experiencing an urban environment on foot in the presence of other people, whether on the street or in public transport, experiences that actually form the basis of ties to form that can later become weak ties or even strong ties. We need that urban experience to actually establish those meeting points, those contact points. And if the urban environment doesn't allow us to do any of that, if we basically experience our strong ties at home and at work and in between move in a metal box, shielded from the rest of the city, from the rest of its inhabitants, we have a lesser chance to actually form those latent ties that become so important for social information diffusion and access to opportunity in cities. Fourth, there's also a spatial argument. For cities to be dense and diverse, it's relatively inefficient for people to get around by cars. If we concentrate multiple passengers to a vehicle, then a typical 3-meter lane can funnel up to about 2,000 people per direction per hour. If we take the same 3-hour lane and dedicate it to a bus lane, the indicator goes up to about 6,000, to light rail to about 11,000, to heavy rail well over 25,000, up to about 50,000 in some cities that have very long heavy rail systems with more than 5 cars. And for walking and cycling, the number is up to the point of human congestion. That 3-meter lane can process about 10,000 people, whether cycling or walking per direction per hour. So from a spatial perspective, if we want to have cities dense and diverse, it's efficient to dedicate the space to non-motorized modes. So you can see that spatially in real world examples. A place like Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually has turned a corner, and they're now pretty successfully revitalizing their downtown. But in the early 2000s, it had roughly 80% of its land in the central area dedicated to roads and parking lots, and only 20% of it covered with land uses that are actually destinations. And so it had about a 90% mode share by car. In a city like San Francisco, where the urban form is very different, it's denser, more diverse, vehicular mode share is around 35%. The rest is public transport, walking, cycling. So to sustain dense and diverse cities, it's efficient to foster non-motorized transportation. And we see that also in cities around the world, besides the US example. This is Canberra, Australia, where the green and blue parts of the modal split are showing walking, public transport, and cycling. And that share in Canberra together as a sort of sustainable modal share that's non-vehicular based is only about 20%. And Canberra is a very sparse city. Its density is roughly 500 people per square kilometer. If we move on to a place like Washington, DC, where the density is 4,300 per square kilometer, we get a much larger sustainable modal split where we have a much larger share of walking, cycling, and public transit use, and a smaller share of private vehicles. If we move up to about 7,800 people per square kilometer, like in Singapore, on average citywide, the private motorized mode share shrinks even further, and the sustainable modes together occupy roughly 2/3 of all trips. If we go to a place like Tokyo, similar density, and as in Singapore, the mode share is similar. If we keep going to really high densities like Paris, for instance, where we have 21,000 people on average per square kilometer, the sustainable mode share is really among the top in the world. Close to 90% travel is without a car in Paris. And in Paris, we have all the ingredients for a highly sustainable mobility, because we have a very dense urban form, we have world-class public transit system, and very walkable streets, and the climate is supportive of that. As a side note, the population density of Paris is on par with central Beirut, as we've observed. So Beirut's density in central areas, at least, is also about 22,000 per square kilometer. So it's no surprise that cities that end up being ranked very highly in all sorts of livability indices globally nowadays all tend to offer a fairly robust, walkable and transit-friendly urban environments. Places like Melbourne, Australia, that I'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation, Vienna, Vancouver, etc. These are all places that are highly walkable and boast high-quality public transport systems. This has also become an economic argument for why cities are investing in walkability, because a lot of the sort of both regional and international workforce is increased that has competitive job opportunities in various cities, is increasingly demanding a higher quality of life. To be in a place that has boasts walkability, that boasts a high quality living environment where you can get around without a car. So we've probably heard about Mayor Anne Hidalgo of Paris popularizing the idea of the 15-minute city, many other cities following suit, or cities making very ambitious plans to actually either significantly reduce or altogether ban vehicles in their central cities. Like, for instance, Helsinki is planning to phase out cars or privately owned cars in their city center altogether by 2035. How do we analyze? How do we think about the built environment and how we can plan it for a transition towards more walking trips over time? The tools and the sort of ideas behind this research partly come from urban design and architecture, and partly from transportation research. In urban design, people have been fascinated by this capacity of the built environment to impact mobility for a long time. The Smithsons, Alison and Peter Smithsons, have called this capacity of the built environment to affect what happens in between the buildings, how people move on streets and the built environment between them, as the charged void. They argue that there's a capacity for architecture to charge the space around it with energy, which can define the nature of things that might come, anticipate happenings. But they generally, just like most architects, claim that it's a capacity we can feel and act on, but cannot necessarily describe or record. In other words, they obviously agree that the built environment, the land use planning, the density, the configuration of the built environment can affect the modalities and activity patterns that take place between the buildings, but there's something that we can't quite analyze. We can simply feel and have an intuition about. Jane Jacobs has famously discussed, I think this internet connection just dropped. Jane Jacobs has famously discussed this as a sidewalk ballet in the context of New York. And let's see if we can get this up and running. Hopefully this will connect. I think the internet just dropped off. Okay, we should be back. Okay. And let me go back one. And Jan Gehl, a famous Danish urbanist who works with many cities around the world, has written a book called Life Between Cities, about the same idea that the way we design our cities will produce the life that happens in between the buildings. But the architectural community generally is not very explicit about how the design of the built environment affects the mobility patterns between the buildings. It's assumed to be something that's innate and intuitive. On the other hand, in the transport community, we have developed very elaborate models from the original 4-step model that starts with trip generation to distribution to modal choice and route assignment, to nowadays activity-based models that account for various modes of travel and can be predictive over time. There hasn't been a very strong emphasis on pedestrians. Their emphasis has largely been on motorized transportation, whether it's public transport, buses and rail, or wheel transport, private cars, taxis, etc., with fairly little attention, generally speaking, on pedestrians. So this is a really interesting space to fill on an analytic basis. So in our research group, we have been developing methods and tools to model cities as spatial networks, along which we can analyze and model pedestrian flows. We can represent any kind of built environment as a spatial network, from a single building that's three-dimensional to streets, along with the activities that take place around its edges in the side buildings, to districts, to entire metropolitan areas. For instance, we can take an environment like the MIT campus with a Killian court in the middle here, and represent it as a spatial network, where we have the streets, the outdoor walkways, but also indoor walkways, every corridor, every staircase, or every elevator that connects up to a spatial networks, which can then be used for routing and trip assignment. We've developed software to do that, called the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox, which was originally developed as a GIS plugin, but now is mostly been developed as a Rhino plugin, for the reason that we wanted the software and the tools to be closer to the people who actually change the built environment, who actually design a built environment, so that the analysis would be at the fingertips rather than requiring a very lengthy kind of feedback loop. And so I'm going to show a couple of things, a couple of examples of what we do with this software, and then I'll go to some of the applied examples. The Urban Network Analysis tool effectively allows us to construct networks, either by importing data sets from cities or from GIS data sets that can be street networks and sidewalk networks that can contain building locations or transit locations, etc. We can turn those into topologically connected networks that can be used for routing analysis. It can be used for manipulating attributes, so we can either import various attributes to those buildings and streets, etc., or reassign them and edit them in the toolbox itself. It can be used to analyze those networks with various tools, and I'll talk briefly about the accessibility tools and the routing tools that we have developed, and then to also bring those results back out into other software and to visualize and to analyze and present them, as we will be also doing at the workshop tomorrow. So for instance, one very simple index that matters for pedestrian a great deal is a simple accessibility index that quantifies what can you get access to, what can you reach within a reasonable short walk. What can you get to within a 5-minute walk or 10-minute walk or 15-minute walk if you are constrained to the street network or sidewalk network and try to go in every direction until you hit that time limit. Here's a chart that shows how far people are willing to walk to get to a bus stop in the North American context. What's important about this chart is that this data comes from different cities, Washington, Edmonton, Calgary, Bay Ridges, some small communities in British Columbia, etc. There's two very important commonalities in this chart. One is that there is a kind of an exponential or logistic nature to how the willingness to walk the bus stop drops off. So it's not a linear decay, it's either an exponential or a logistic decay rate. And second, roughly at about 600 or 700 meters, it drops to close to zero. So we know that for people, in this instance, to go to bus stops, the willingness to walk is fairly short. It's only about 600 to 700 meters away. And after that, people generally are not willing to take a walk to the bus stop. We see some difference between cities. For instance, even in the same city, we see Washington, D.C. is that thin black line, and Washington, D.C., that's high income in Washington, D.C. is the thin black line. Washington, D.C. low income is the thick gray line. And we see that the thick gray line is above the thin black line, which means that low income communities are generally willing to walk longer, probably because less access to different transportation modes, less ability to pay for alternatives. But generally, all groups follow that curve. So we can incorporate that into an accessibility index and measure ourselves what opportunities pedestrians have access to in different spatial contexts. Here I'm showing how we do that in the urban network analysis toolbox by first constructing a network, choosing origins and destinations, running the analysis, and then measuring, in this instance, accessibility from all census blocks in the Cambridge area to public transportation. And we can do that from buildings, from residential locations, or from job locations, et cetera, and then compute an accessibility index for every address point about how good is access to various types of destinations. Now, this is the most important prerequisite for anybody to walk. If we don't have destinations to walk to, generally nobody will walk. So having destinations, and desirably a diverse set of destinations within walking range, within that comparable distance that fits into that decay curve, is a fundamental prerequisite for people to get out, even more so than the quality of the sidewalks. I would argue that the quality of the sidewalks comes after the destination. So the most important thing is to have the destinations which come with density. We can measure this, in this instance, not just to subway stops, but to both subway and bus stops from every address point. This is the context of Cambridge and Somerville in the US. And we could measure it for different types of destinations. So here we see that the public transit quality, public transit accessibility is the highest in some areas like here. This is actually Harvard University area. This is Central Square. MIT is here pretty poorly served by public transport compared to these areas. And downtown Boston gets pretty high results again. Or we could measure it to other destination types like jobs. In this instance, the same origin points from buildings, we measure access to jobs, and the result would look very different. Second, we can use the tools to not only measure access to opportunities, but also estimate how people might access these opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. In this instance, I'm showing how we can use the toolbox to measure access and route the trips from individual homes in the Cambridge area to the available subway stops. So we set the network up, we set the homes as origin points, the 3 subway stops as destination points, and then we route trips to the destinations. Now, this is an important point where we don't simply assume that people will take the shortest path, and we also don't assume that they will go necessarily to the nearest stop. We route trips to any available stop that is within a range, and we distinguish the destination probabilities based on their accessibilities. So the same concept of accessibility from the previous slide is used here to distinguish the destination choice. So the more accessible destinations, which are either have more attractive qualities, like have several subway lines, for instance, or those that are closer to the people's origin points, get higher probabilities. And then for each destination that is available, we route trips along all plausible paths, not just the shortest path. And usually those are paths that are up to something like 15 to 20% longer than the shortest path. And then we keep track of how many of those go on different segments and can adjust how different demographic groups may generate those trips. So for instance, working age, younger people may be more ready transit users than children or the elderly, who are much less likely to use it, or based on income. For instance, higher income folks may have more options and be less likely to ride public transport. So I'm going to show as an example, how do we bring these types of analysis into practice and applied research. In most cases, when urban development occurs in the US context, but increasingly also internationally, when we put up sizable developments in cities, and in the US, the threshold is usually 100,000 square feet, which is about 10,000 square meters. If the development size exceeds that, the development has to do what's called an environmental review, or one part of that is traffic impact assessment. As part of this traffic impact assessment, developers will have to analyze how the proposed development will create traffic flow during peak hours on the city streets. And if those peak hour traffic flows exceed the level of service that the street is designed for or currently has, then they result in various mitigation measures. For instance, they will result in signal readjustments, road widenings, extra parking provisions, additional turning lanes, etc. This is one hidden policy in cities around the world that constantly requires that as new development comes about, that we adjust our infrastructure to more driving, because the analysis is directly tying development to vehicular flow. So in this applied research that I'm going to show, we've tried to do something similar, but from a pedestrian point of view, to analyze how development that comes about affects pedestrian flows around the place rather than vehicular flows. This research was implemented in Melbourne and co-authored by Ronak Basu and also Bahij, who's with us here. We worked in Melbourne because Melbourne is one of the cities in the world that has excellent pedestrian count data. In fact, Melbourne has been counting its pedestrian traffic with automated sensors for close to 10 years now. Today, there's about 92 of those sensors in downtown streets. They're overhanging typically on these cantilevers over sidewalks, and they count everyone who goes past them underneath. This offers a great data set for pedestrian impact analysis for two key reasons. One, the data is large and it's in a public API. The city of Melbourne puts it up every hour, uploads the new values from the past hour from the sensors, and it's publicly available for anybody to analyze. The large nature of the data set makes it possible to calibrate a good model. And two, because the data is longitudinal from multiple years, we can do a predictive model and then check how good the predictions are. So we can calibrate a model of pedestrian flows and then see how development activities come about, forecast how those development activities would likely change pedestrian flow on city streets, and then check how good the predictions are. The charts on the right here show the typical daily patterns. On the top chart, we see the typical weekday, which has these three, the blue line is the weekday. So there's three typical humps. There's a morning peak, lunch peak, and evening peak of pedestrian activity. And the gray line underneath it is the weekend pattern, where typically we just have people coming out on the streets gradually peaking around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock p.m. and then fading off. But you notice also how weekend activities on the gray line tend to be slightly higher than weekdays, so people stay out later on the streets. And the lower chart here shows how rain or weather can affect that. So on rainy days, the whole pattern shifts down a little bit, but overall pedestrian activity or counts on the city streets are relatively similar in pattern. What we did is a study of pedestrian flows in this central city area, and this is analogous to what we're trying to do here in Beirut together with Dr. Abu Zaid's group. Here we did the counts manually by hiring a counting firm. In Melbourne, we had the privilege of just downloading the counts that the city had collected anyway. So these are the sensor locations, the orange dots where the actual counts occurred. We combined the count data as the dependent variable that we're trying to forecast with our model with pretty detailed land use and employment data. It's called the CLUE data set in Melbourne. It contains address level information about how many people are in each building, how many jobs are in each building, how many establishments or businesses, or even the sizes of those businesses. We added to that also data about public transportation locations, parks, schools, universities, tourist attractions, all sorts of land uses in the city. And additionally, we factored in weather and temperature, rain and temperature into the weather pattern in our model. This is what the data set sort of spatially can look like. Underneath it, we have a sidewalk network. So all these thin gray lines are sidewalks or park footpaths everywhere a pedestrian can walk. The city of Melbourne keeps very good track of that data, so we didn't even have to assemble that data, was available. And then these colorful dots are all various origins and destinations where pedestrian trips can start from or go to. They can either be origins or destinations. This can potentially form a multitude of various trip types, origin-destination pairs. We could have trips that go from, for instance, during the morning peak period, from tram stops to jobs, from train stops to jobs, from jobs to restaurants or food businesses, and so forth. So in this model, we tested, we actually measured various kinds of origin-destination trips, and then analyzed which ones of those types of trips actually explain the observed foot traffic that was counted on city streets. As I mentioned earlier, we don't assume that people from these origins destinations make the shortest journey. There's several adjustments in this process. If we have 100 people at the origin location, first we apply some distance decay rate to them. So just as I showed from this bus stop data from a TRB study, we apply either an exponential or a logistic decay rate, and in this instance decrease. We're saying that not all of the 100 people are likely to make a trip, only perhaps 75 of them because of the distance involved. So it really depends on what decay rate we're using and what distance is involved. Second, we don't assume that they take the shortest path. We find in the software all available paths that are up to X% longer than the shortest path. And route trips, we basically split the trips up with equal probability on all the routes. Now, this can be further adjusted to account for the route qualities. If some routes are nicer than others, we can account for that in the network, and so that the routing will route more trips along those segments and routes that have a lower perceived cost, that have better qualities from a pedestrian perspective. So this is a simple example from just one origin to a destination, but we do that with hundreds of origins or even thousands of origins, thousands of destinations. So all sorts of trips for different trip types. I also mentioned that we have a destination choice model. So for many types of pedestrian journeys, if you think about how we would model it, for instance, if you thought about how to go to lunch from this very room during a workday, then you probably have 5 or 6 or maybe more lunch options within a 10-minute walk around here. Like you could go up to the streets, you could go to Hamra, you could go to various canteens on the campus, etc. So how do we deal with that situation? We don't know exactly what destination a pedestrian is going to go to, and we therefore don't want to model the trip to just only one, for instance, the best or the nearest type of destination. What we do instead is we find all the destinations that are actually available within a reasonable walkshed distance, and then we compute a probability for each of them, and we split the trip up to each destination type. So if in this instance, I'm showing one origin, which is a residential building, and 13 different bus stops around it. We calculate the accessibility of each of the bus stops, which is in itself a factor of attractiveness and travel cost. It's a ratio of the two. And we based on those accessibility indices, we assign a probability, which is a ratio of a particular destination's accessibility, gravity accessibility in this case, divided by the sum of accessibilities of all the destinations. And so in this instance, I've assigned, or this happens to be a more attractive bus stop. So this bus stop has more departures than any other in this system. So therefore, it gets a higher allocation. And not only because it's close, but also because it has more departures of buses. So if we use bus departures as the destination attractiveness index, then this would get a higher probability allocation. So we use this sort of a destination choice model for all of those trip types. We have from, for instance, if we route trips from workplaces to restaurants, then we route from each workplace to multiple restaurants at the same time. And each time they take different routes on the network, up to 20% longer than the shortest route. We then fit the estimated flows. First, we check how they individually correlate with the pedestrian counts, in this case, over multiple years. Initially, we developed this model for 2014 data, but then we tested it over many other years. And then we decide which factors go together into a calibration model, in which case we actually used, in this instance, a machine learning model called the standard vector regression type model. We also tried a multi-level model for fitting the data. The fit is not so different. For the morning peak hour, we estimated how a certain set of flows explains the foot traffic measured by the sensors on the city streets, and achieve around 92% accuracy on the calibration. During the lunch period, 96%, during PM period, 93%. The reason why we prefer to ultimately go with the machine learning type model is instead of the linear model, like the multi-level model, is that machine learning models have two properties that are desirable for this type of fitting. They don't assume linearity. So we know that some of these destination relationships may be non-linear. We don't necessarily know that having more destinations will linearly increase pedestrian flows. They may be non-linear relationships. And second, they deal really well with multiple linearity. So the linear models typically have a real issue with collinearity. So you have to use something like a ridge regression to overcome that. But machine learning models actually are not affected by multicollinearity at all. And so if you have flows that go from workplaces to train stops and workplaces to tram stops, they're bound to overlap a lot in the spatial network. So they're going to be collinear with each other. And that's a problem for estimation. But in this instance, they can be overcome. And so we use the model to then forecast on the right-hand side. You see not the calibration, but the prediction. So effectively, we calibrated the model on the observed conditions in 2014. That's on the left. Then we added the developments that actually occurred in Melbourne over the one-year period, all the new buildings, land uses that took place in the city center. And based on those land use changes, we forecast how pedestrian flows would change on all the streets in downtown. And I'll show that in a minute. And then so this right-hand chart shows how well the prediction matched the actual records when we went and looked that up. So we forecast with 78% accuracy during the AM period, 82% accuracy on the lunch period, and 74% during the evening period using the SVR model. This can also then be used to break down what kinds of pedestrian flows, in the case of Melbourne, explain what we see during the different peak periods. In the AM period, which is upper left chart, we see that the pedestrian flows are really dominated by the trips between job locations and train stations. So people coming by train to the city center and walking to jobs. Melbourne is one of those cities that has several 100,000 jobs in the CBD, but only about 50,000 inhabitants. So there's a huge commuter population coming into the city by 6 train stations and going to their jobs. This is followed by trips between employment locations and car parking, so people parking their cars and going to their jobs, or even just residences and employment, so walking to jobs. During the lunch period, it's a different picture. During the lunch period, the peak activity is walking from amenities to other amenities. So it's basically people walking on main streets between lunch places, businesses, retailers, restaurants, and so forth. And during the evening peak period, the picture reverts back to something similar to the morning, but with slight differences. So it's not dominated as much by the journeys from jobs to train stations to go back home, but there's more heterogeneous activity. For instance, we have a new type of flow, which is jobs to food places that enters the picture, which was not significant on the other charts. And so there's a little bit more diverse activity in the evening peak periods. So these are the activities that dominate during the different periods. Having calibrated the model at these sensor locations, which are denoted by the orange dots, the calibrated model can then be used to estimate pedestrian activity on all the streets, not only those streets that were used for calibration. So we're estimating it out on all streets. So this is our estimate of pedestrian flow. The numbers here denote people per hour on each street segment. So the thickest black lines are about 4,500 people per hour on a segment. And the thin lines are in the order of 500, 600, 700. We see during the morning peak period, the highest activity tends to be close to train stations. That's where the commuters come into the city, and those streets are the ones that are going to be most crowded. But the advantage here is that we didn't have to actually count pedestrians on every street. We just had the counts on a handful of streets, and then based on that calibration, could estimate out and kind of distribution and volume of this pedestrians on all the streets in the city center. Now, this can be used to make decisions. If we know that in the morning peak hour, the highest pedestrian volumes are in some part, we can make sure that the sidewalks are better on that streets. The public investments are more generous. We put better street furniture, and et cetera, et cetera. But it can also be used to evaluate how development activity can shift or change these pedestrian flows. Every year, new projects get built. Some places lose residents, some places gain residents, some places lose jobs, some places gain jobs. New restaurants or other retail destinations or even transit stations can be created. We didn't look at changed transit stations. We kept transit stations fixed, but we did incorporate all new business destinations, including restaurants, and the change in population and jobs throughout the city center. So here you see pretty faded out colors, but essentially, all the buildings or properties that are shown in blue had an increase in jobs or residences over a one-year period from 2014 to 2015. And those that are shown in red had a decrease or drop in population or jobs within the one-year period. So based on these changes that actually occurred, our model forecasts these changes for foot traffic. So these red and blue lines show the delta or the change in foot traffic that we forecast. The thick blue lines, for instance, forecast an additional 2,000 pedestrians per hour in some areas where, for instance, where that concentration happens down here and up here. This is the Chinatown area up there, and this is by one of the main train stations and the newly developed area along the Yarra River. These were very fast developing areas. They had high-rise buildings built within a single year. So lots of new gross floor area created. But some streets also are forecasted to decrease because development moved away or new destinations were created nearby where the trips are shifting. And so just like we do with traffic impact assessments in cities around the world, our hope is that this sort of analysis can be brought to pedestrian impact assessment. That when developers are proposing buildings, they would do an analysis of how that development impacts pedestrian flows around them during peak hours, and then that cities can use this analysis as evidence to request developer contributions, not to more traffic lanes, not to more parking or signal adjustments for cars, but rather to pedestrian infrastructure, better, safer crossings, better public spaces, better sidewalks, etc. So that project by project, cities can actually create more walkable conditions around where development occurs. I won't go into this. We kind of calibrated this model for multiple years and looked at its stability. Generally, things were stable, but some interesting differences over the years. I want to finish by talking a little bit about pedestrian route choice. So when in these models, when we route trips from origins to destinations, we typically do that based on a sample of routes that are up to a certain % longer than the shortest route. But I mentioned earlier that this can be adjusted by route quality. So for instance, some streets are much nicer to walk than others. So if pedestrians are faced with a choice, sometimes they're willing to perhaps deviate to a longer route, but the route is quieter, safer, more pleasant, etc. How do we understand what qualities of the built environment attract pedestrians and draw them to walk longer routes, to walk on nicer streets, and which are the qualities that deter pedestrians that they don't want to walk on? For this, we have analyzed data from 2 cities so far, San Francisco and Boston, where we actually had trajectory data for that route choice analysis, and I'll come to that in a second. So this route choice question is not hypothetical. It actually happens all the time. In grid-driven street patterns or generally well-connected street patterns, including here in Beirut, where blocks are relatively small, we always have choices of how to walk, which route to take, with very minimal changes in route length. For instance, in a grid type of environment, like in New York City, if you were to walk from St. Patrick's Cathedral to Carnegie Hall, without extending the trip at all, you would have roughly 84 route options that are equidistant from each other. So always lots of choice. Which way would you walk? Different routes have different properties, and we can test that in a route choice model, whether the dimension of the sidewalks, the presence of businesses on the ground floor, trees and shading, how much sky exposure or blue sky we can see, and all sorts of other properties like how traffic the roads are, et cetera, can be attributes included in a route choice model for pedestrians. So in this study, we obtained data from an app provider who in 2014 and 2015, in a one-year period, when these activity-based apps were actually relatively young and starting, obtained a trajectory data from their users. We had over 200,000 anonymous GPS traces of pedestrians in San Francisco and similar amount in Boston. We didn't know who the people are, and the data was about 5 years old when we got it. And we actually further cleaned the data to just about 11,000 trajectories for the Boston area and 14 or 15,000 trajectories for the San Francisco area. A lot of those trajectories were very short, so they were not appropriate for any choice estimation. There was no choice. It was just a direct route. Some were also too long, which indicated that they may have been actually on a vehicle, on a tramway or a bus, moving just very slowly like a pedestrian. And some included very meandering trajectories, had 7 or more turns. And we concluded that these are probably routes of that actually have multiple purposes, are not just going from A to B. So we did a lot of route cleaning and ended up with about 14,000 in our sample. Now, each raw pedestrian trace from a GPS was first map matched to a particular street segment using a map matching algorithm from Newson and Krum. And then we generated alternatives. You can think of those as when you open Google Maps and it asks you, you ask Google Maps how to walk from A to B, it generally offers you 3 options. Generally, those options are within a short buffer from each other. They're similar in distance. We generated, I think, 3 alternatives for each route that are roughly similar distance, and then analyzed or added the properties of all the streets that we were keen to test in the model. So for instance, we analyzed how wide are the sidewalks on both the route you actually walked or somebody actually walked and on the alternatives. What were the traffic levels? How much greenery was there? How many amenities were on the ground floor? How much upward slope there was in San Francisco? And we tested various things like how many public art pieces you go by, what's the traffic volume per day on those roads, etc. We then put this into a path choice model. There is a path choice model that was developed by Michel Bierleer in late 1999, which has this path choice correction term compared to a typical choice model, and basically estimated coefficients for each of these properties we tested in the model. Here I show results from both the Boston model and the San Francisco model. Generally, with these path choice models, we get a beta coefficient for each attribute. But what I'm showing here is coefficient ratios, where each coefficient is then divided by the length coefficient, which effectively gives us the distance equivalent effect of each of these characteristics. So what we see is, for instance, that the one turn on a route in the context of San Francisco is perceived as equivalent to 62 meters of extra walking. So it's fairly costly to make turns for San Franciscans on their network. In Boston, one turn is perceived as only about 34 meters equivalent. And this is partly because the street networks are very different. San Francisco has a gridiron street network, and so the opportunities to reduce turns are almost everywhere. So you can almost always have a route that is much more zigzaggy versus a route that's just one turn, like 2 segments that you turn. So the street grid offers greater opportunities for reducing turns in San Francisco. In San Francisco, also elevation gain is interesting. A 1 meter gain in elevation for the pedestrians in our data set is perceived roughly as equivalent to walking 4 extra meters. So it's a cost. But some things are benefits. So for instance, amenities have a positive effect. So passing 10 extra amenities in San Francisco is perceived as equivalent to the walk being 18 meters shorter, or one amenity is 1.8 meters shorter. Sidewalk width is similarly having a 10-foot increase, which is about a 3-meter increase on average throughout the whole sidewalk on your route, is perceived as the walk being 83 meters shorter. So it's something that people gravitate towards. Traffic speeds and traffic volumes are negative. So having an extra 1,000 vehicles per hour on a road during the peaks is this along the way on average is perceived as the route being 61 meters longer, et cetera, et cetera. So this gives us some sense of how different qualities of sidewalks affect pedestrian route choice preference and where pedestrians would rather walk in the context of Boston and San Francisco. There's been other studies that have looked at this from a bicycle perspective. For instance, this study by Hood et al. In 2011 analyzed GPS traces from bicycles in also San Francisco area and used different factors. They did include also turns, and they found that for bicyclists, the value of the distance equivalent value of one turn is roughly 170 meters. And they used other things like biking in the wrong way, having bike routes and paths of different types, also elevation gain, and put a factor on each of these qualities. And so once we have these results, they're useful for several purposes. One, we can include them in our routing algorithm. And when we do routing from origins to destinations for pedestrians, we can route them according to these coefficients by changing the perceived distance of every segment or route in the study. And two, we can then also delineate how we measure accessibility. We don't necessarily have to measure accessibility by, let's say, a 10-minute walk shed objectively, but we could look at a 10-minute walk shed based on perceived time, based on these attributes. So that's what we've done in at least one of the study areas. We've actually delineated perceived walk sheds for different regional rail stations called commuter rail stations around Boston from both a biking and walking perspective. And I'm going to try to show you the map here live. So this is a, you can actually look it up. It's called boston.transit-access .com. The address is up here. And what we see here, for instance, we can toggle different things off. So I'm going to turn off the bicycling access. If we were to assume that each transit station has a circular half-mile catchment area, and turn this on, and then the circles, this is oftentimes used in transit analysis, right? The circles delineate a perfect half-mile radius. They're typically far greater than what may be called the network radius, which is shown in red. And this is basically half-mile along the network rather than a perfect circle. But those yellow polygons inside the red ones are half-mile according to perceived time rather than an objective half-mile. And this perceived time is based on the route choice analysis I showed before. So based on traffic levels, traffic volumes, amenities, sidewalk dimensions on the streets. So typically they are smaller than the network catchments. And we can do that for also bicycling. So I'm just going to turn on for 1.5 mile radii. So for these are 1.5 mile radii for bicycles. This is based on the results from this Hood et al. Study. These are 1.5 mile network radii along where we just constrain it to the available streets. And these are actually the 1.5 mile perceived conditions based on what infrastructure is actually available, whether bike paths exists, whether you have to go against traffic, whether there's incline and slope, etc. So the perceived accessibility ranges can be quite different from the actual ones. And what this website simply allows us to do is to look at system-wide across the MBTA or the commuter rail stations in Greater Boston to give perhaps a more accurate assessment of actual transit-oriented development potential around all the stations. So if we use the circles as our criterion for transit access for instance, pedestrians, they would probably overestimate the number of jobs that are within transit access areas. In fact, the perceived distance, if we delineated our access areas based on perceived travel distance rather than the circles, then these perceived catchment areas that are half a mile long would only contain 38% of the jobs that are actually included in the half-mile circles. So these perceived catchment areas tend to be far smaller and perhaps give us a more accurate, behaviorally grounded perspective of what is actually accessible to pedestrians in the different catchment areas. And these we can explore through various things also from bicycle access and change the attributes here. But with that, I would like to thank you and finish here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and sharing your work. So from a climate perspective, right, a lot of decision making in public spaces and streets is based on climate. People tend to walk on, such as now in Beirut, on shaded streets, right? Or oppositely, if it's a cold context, in sunny streets. So does that contribute somehow into the knowledge base of the decision-making process in your model?
Yes, it does. It's a great question. We looked at that with some of the route choice preference data between San Francisco and Boston. They too have fairly different climates. San Francisco is generally much nicer throughout the year, but Boston gets cold winters with lots of snow. One of the factors that actually found significantly different was whether people prefer to walk in streets that are open to the sky, where you get more sunlight into the streets. In Boston, we found people prefer that. They prefer more exposure to the sky, probably because half the year they're just catching the sun rays into the street. In San Francisco, they preferred the opposite. They preferred more shade than in the Boston case. So we found that, but indeed, it's very important to look where the study was calibrated, where the coefficients were measured, and then use that. I've personally done some estimation also in Singapore, which is somewhat similar to Beirut's climate, maybe more humid. And we found not only we haven't, some other colleagues have done route choice models from ETH, Future Cities Labs, and like Kai Axhausen's group, for instance. But we looked at also those decay rates. It's very different. In Boston, people are willing to walk a kilometer to get to transit. In Singapore, 400 meters. And the difference is partly behavioral, but partly also what they have on offer. The network in Singapore is fairly dense. And generally speaking, in areas that have public transit coverage, you don't necessarily need to walk that much longer. A lot of the density is deliberately built nearby transit stations. But yes, the short answer to your question is these factors matter a great deal, and it's very important, especially for applying a model in a different climatic context to factor in those differences.
And even you mentioned humidity, so this is related to wind, right? And the geometry of the streets, the orientation with respect to prevailing wind flows, etc.
So for that in particular, we're currently doing research with a colleague of mine, Christoph Reinhardt's group, who has a architecture environment group. We're using the UTCI index, which is a Universal Thermal Comfort Index, and that takes into account wind, temperature, radiant heat, and humidity. 4 factors that go into the UTCI, right? And then we're trying to figure out we're actually using data in San Francisco and Portugal to see how UTCI affects pedestrian route choice. Do people really gravitate towards the more comfortable streets? What we're finding in San Francisco, we don't find an effect, and we think that it's because it doesn't have extreme enough conditions. But now we're trying to do this in Lisbon, Portugal, where their summers are burning, and so we're expecting to see some difference there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have also a question concerning that logistic curve. So you mentioned how spread things are in the city and income as a potential differentiator between how much people are willing to walk.
Yes.
Have you rescaled by city size and income and see whether you'd get a data collapse on a like universal curve?
Oh, we haven't quite yet. I guess don't necessarily have the empirical data about how far. We don't have enough of a sample to really do it across cities yet. But there are other papers have looked at, and I guess it could potentially be done. We certainly have found that there is a income difference, right? For instance, not only in Washington D.C. but in every city practically in the U.S., high-income folks tend to walk shorter distances and drive more. But indeed, it's probably possible to gather data from different studies to do a scaling across that.
And if I may follow up on a question related to also these, if I may call them network motifs for what is opposed to like vehicular traffic motifs as the pedestrian motifs. Have you looked at how stable they are seasonally, like home, work, let's say?
Yeah, I'll briefly go back to this slide from Melbourne. Let's see. I kind of glossed over this, but in this model, we didn't do it seasonally, we did it annually. So here we have a same feature importance. So this these feature importance factors that are here depicting the 2014 conditions, we kind of asked ourselves, would it differ if we did this model for 2015? Would the lunch trips be different than amenities to amenities? Maybe something else going on. So we did it for every year here that was available in the data set from 2014 to 2019. Generally, they were fairly stable, but with some interesting differences that I glossed over. For instance, what we found in the AM peak during the morning, so it's 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the morning, the trips between train stations and employment were consistently most important. But there were some, like for instance, from 2015 to 16, we see a decline. We went actually in to investigate what's going on here, because additionally, so from 2014 to 15, we see a rise, but the second line has a sharp decline, which is the car parking lots to jobs. So why is that occurring? Why is the model shifting like that? It turns out that a fairly interesting effect there was that Melbourne in January 2015, so right, it's like in the middle of those data, made inner city public transportation free of charge and equalized pricings from zone 1 and 2 regional rail travel. So basically it made a lot cheaper for zone 2 people to travel to city center than before. We think that that temporary kink there has something to do with that the pricing policy changed for public transportation and driving became less attractive. Also, for instance, during the lunch period, we see the amenity trips dominate in all the years, but it's kind of sloping a little bit downward over time. We don't know exactly what's at the heart of this. There are a couple of hypotheses. On the one hand, it may be that the deliveries and the apps are picking up, and so people are going out less and getting food delivered. But in fact, we also found that in the newly developed areas in the city, they have provided fewer amenities per capita than in the older established parts of the city. So the ratio of amenities, those are lunch destinations, to development has been actually diminishing. And we think that's part of the story too, that it may take time for the new development to develop all these ground floor amenities and businesses to pick up again. But so far, it's been building so fast that Melbourne has a really rapid development curve that that may be part of the reason why that type of trip is diminishing.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation and for making us just take us away from Beirut for a little while and think of science and how it can actually really feed public policy. I'm actually wondering exactly about that. So what is the public body or the public decision makers who read this work? Does it feed back into decisions that are being taken in a city like Boston or San Francisco where you're working? And I'm also wondering if you're feeling the same way about Beirut. Like, what kind of challenges do you see? Like, who would you imagine to be an audience that would read this work once it's transposed to a context as challenging as ours? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think the applicability actually varies quite a bit of what part of the analysis process we're talking about. If we're talking about an estimate of flows on city streets like this, right? I think this has pretty broad applicability to know that in the morning peak period, we estimate that these and these streets have that many people, and we could possibly take it apart by trip type. For instance, we could say, okay, let's only examine the routes to schools, homes to school, people taking their kids to schools, or going to public transport, etc. So this could potentially be an input to many decision makers, right? Where do we invest into a better sidewalk? Where do we do street coming? Yeah, so it's a little bit early to say. We are currently, we've just put in a kind of collaborative proposal with New York City, who is very interested, their planning and transport departments. We went in for a grant together, and their intent is to use it for their decision making. This analysis is fairly new. This paper is 2021, and so we've talked with the planners in Melbourne, presented it to them. We'd like to do a little bit more with them. Also, we've received very good signals in Cambridge. I've actually calibrated a similar model for Cambridge, Mass. Right now, there's a sense that a lot of cities feel like, yes, we need to change course from their practice as usual, but there's so much inertia behind that. To actually change course is difficult, as I'm sure you know. But we've seen that, for instance, in Cambridge, they particularly were interested in changing how to do development approvals, that they want to include more progressive views in how to approve developments, not just on the old traffic model. In New York, they were not really thinking they can negotiate with a developer that if you develop here, you're going to do this. What they wanted this for is really for their own planning, that they said, okay, if we do public space planning in different parts, it would be good to know how many people are around. But we haven't really worked with the city government yet but we're currently exploring a few that seem to be attracted to this and would like to. They tend to be cities who care about walking a lot, also including in San Francisco, actually. I was interested when we had these recent meetings with the New York City Department of City Planning. It's one of the very few cities that I've ever encountered on Earth that has the pedestrian unit in their transportation department. They have a whole team of people who only think about pedestrians. That doesn't happen very often. I think Vienna maybe have one, or London, but not so often.
Thank you. I have a question. If you go on sites like zero.com, they have something called walking score. And then customers or buyers, they use the score and they have to buy or not buy in a certain place. So now you have a financial incentive. The UNA that you have, is there a way to, I mean, what's your comment on the walking score, how scientific it is, and then with the UNA?
Walk score is an accessibility index. Walk score is an accessibility index, just like the gravity index that I showed, that bundles a few different things together. It's basically an index that measures how accessible destinations are. Walk score doesn't really publicize their formula. That's their business secret, so to speak, but there's some earlier publications that reveal how they used to do it, at least in the past. So in this context, we can just construct our own walk score. Walk score is currently generally available, I think, in North American context, maybe some European cities too, in Australia, I'm not sure, but it's not available in many parts of the world. And what these tools would allow you to do is to construct one yourself for Beirut. If we can come together and agree that these destinations matter, that We could measure accessibility to street-based amenities, shops, restaurants, service businesses, to transit locations, to public institutions, parks, playgrounds, museums, this kind of stuff. We could construct our own walk score and have it for every address point, right, and publicize that. So that's the benefit. I think it's conceptually the same thing. Walk score is simply an accessibility index.
Anders, I have a question. Can you talk a bit about the pros and cons of a model like the UNA versus microscopic pedestrian flow models, like say Paramix or VISIM or
That do agent-based?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's, for example,
one of the downsides of our model vis-a-vis our agent-based model is that we cannot account for any inter-agent interaction. So, for instance, we cannot account for the fact that because of some light cycles and dynamics, like people would crowd onto one place and then it would result. That would be invisible in a network model. But the upside is generally that we can do much greater areas fast, that we don't have to simulate agents in large downtown cores, but we can compute the trips over the network and just I think the scalability is a big advantage to the network-based models.
So it depends on the type of application, basically.
Yeah,
That's
if you're
really
trying to analyze like a station, for instance, a lot of the agent-based micro models are in like very specific areas, like a train station. There it could be quite important to delineate within one space how some corners of the lobby are more used than others, etc. In our case, that would be all like one use parameter. So I think that's generally the results, for instance, for also the feedback loop, if you're actually trying to do some back and forth analysis while designing a space, I think you don't necessarily have to wait for a long simulation run to, you could just compute the index.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Maybe one last question. Okay, well, let's thank Professor Anders Sevtsuk.
Thank you.